Hi, I'm Emma Miner, and this is my history capstone presentation on the paper I wrote last semester, Peace After War, the Japanese Transition to Pacifism in Hiroshima after World War II. To begin, Japan has a long history of warriors, soldiers, and militarism, one which runs deep and was integral to the formation of Japan as a modern nation-state and constructing national identity. This is in sharp contrast to a contemporary Japan, one which is constitutionally pacifist, having, quote, forever renounced war, unquote. This decision to be pacifist was greatly influenced by the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the end of World War II. These catastrophic events are memorialized and recorded in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, which makes it a poignant case study of Japanese nationalism, identity, and cultural memory after World War II. I first want to briefly define nationalism. Benedict Anderson, one of the major theorists I utilized while writing my paper, defines nationalism as an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. In other words, nationalism is not a group of people with a shared geographic region, ethnic heritage, or history, but the imagined connections between the people within these limited groups that make them Japanese. In order to provide context for the rest of my presentation, here is a brief timeline of relevant events. The Meiji Constitution was established in 1889 and set up the role of the emperor, the Japanese citizen, and the elected government. While the Constitution was enforced until the end of World War II, the Meiji period itself came to an end in 1912. At this point, Japanese imperialism was in full swing, having colonized Ryukyu, Taiwan, Manchuria, and Korea. World War I began not long after which Japan emerged as a victor and leader in international geopolitics, placing them in the same category as other industrialized nations. The years between World War I and World War II, Japan saw a swift rise in militarism, but saw its peak during World War II. This includes the forced conscription of Korean men into the Japanese military in 1944. At the end of World War II, the United States drops 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th in 1945, respectively. These bombs caused massive fallouts in both cities, including long-lasting radiation poisoning and other health complications that are still impacting people today. Japan surrendered on September 2nd of 1945 and shortly after developed its most recent constitution. Japan's new constitution, which came into effect in 1947, renounces all future acts of war in international disputes, stating, quote, land, sea, and air forces as well as other war potential will never be maintained, unquote. We can think of the beginning of Japanese nationalism starting with the creation of the Meiji Constitution in 1889. The Meiji Constitution explicitly outlines the role of the emperor as both the head of the Japanese state and as the ruler of the Japanese empire, meaning that Japan's position as a nation-state began with Japan already as an imperial force. Article 18 of the Meiji Constitution states that the, quote, conditions necessary for being a Japanese subject shall be determined by law, unquote. This article uses the term subject as opposed to citizen. This sets up the role of the Japanese emperor as not only the head of state, but an absolute power over the people of Japan and in imperial territories. The open-endedness of Article 18 meant that who was a subject could be changed at any given time, and gave further control to the emperor and the imperial diet to make separate laws, classifications, and rulings on colonized subjects than those who were ethnically Japanese, allowing for the establishment and legitimization of Japanese racial and cultural supremacy. Japanese racial and cultural supremacy was not only effective in maintaining imperial rule, but in developing a Japanese identity which allowed for violent colonization to take effect. Nationalism is not only a process by which people create imagined connections between people within a border, it is also a process by which nation-states distinguish themselves from other nation-states and establish supremacy over them. Japanese nationalism not only was developed side by side with imperialism, but indeed relied upon the process of colonization in order to justify itself. One way to think about this is that Japanese people who moved to colonized territories were able to enjoy the privileges of being Japanese outside of the geographic borders of mainland Japan, while colonized subjects in those territories often lived under entirely different legal structures. After World War II, Japan rapidly transitioned into pacifism through the enactment of the 1947 Constitution. Something interesting to note is the rhetoric of renouncing a previous history of violence to a government characterized by peace was used in the formation of both the Meiji Constitution and Japan's 1947 Constitution. The 1947 Constitution additionally changed the role of the emperor. No longer is the emperor selected and given power by sacred and divine right, but rather, quote, from the will of the people with whom resides sovereign power, end quote. Additionally, the Japanese people are now referred to as citizens rather than subjects. Article 9 of the Constitution, also referred to as the Peace Clause, outlines Japan no longer maintaining military forces or utilizing military violence as a means of international conflict resolution. Many peace movements in Japan throughout the 50s and 60s disagreed with what exactly was meant by the renunciation of war and how it ought to be carried out by individuals and the state. It is important to note that the Japanese Constitution does not directly use the word pacifism. Pacifism has particular connotations historically and ideologically, and by not incorporating the specific language allows room for interpretation. This shift broadly to pacifism has allowed for Japan to position itself as a global leader for peace. For example, the city of Hiroshima each year puts out a declaration of peace on the anniversary of the bombing, and there is an international organization, Mayors for Peace, started by the mayor of Hiroshima in the 1980s. This brings us to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and the ways in which public history shaped cultural and national identity. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum develops an identity of what it means to be Japanese after World War II. Experiences of A-bomb survivors are recorded through interviews, literature, art, and oral histories, meticulously preserved and publicized. Analyses of when, why, and the direct impacts of those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are plenty and varied with easy accessibility to English and other translations. The Victims and Survivors Gallery is one of many in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. The focus of this gallery is to highlight both the vast array of people who are victims and survivors and on what it means to have survived the bombing. The exhibit, though filled with many individual stories, is curated in such a way that there is a universalization of those experiences. For example, the women who survived the bombings are generally referred to as mothers rather than by their individual name. One moment of this gallery is dedicated to those who are, quote, away from home, unquote. The phrasing of away from home implies a certain amount of choice, which there certainly was for some of the people highlighted, like exchange students and missionaries. However, this section also includes the stories of colonized people. One of the people highlighted is Kwak Kwi-hoon, a Korean man who was conscripted into the Japanese army and stationed in Hiroshima. I encourage you to pause and take a moment to read the wall plaque for his portrait at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. First, while not inaccurate, this severely downplays the reality of Korean conscription into the Japanese army. While there was a program for Korean men to voluntarily join the Japanese army, after Pearl Harbor, Japan found it had a lack of soldiers and so implemented a system which, quote, forced Korean youths to take military exams and to train those youth and send them off to war, end quote. Conscripted Korean soldiers were forcibly made to join the army of their colonizers and fight in World War II on behalf of Japan. Not only can forced conscription be seen as a problematic concept on its own, but is further complicated by the power relations between a colonized territory and the metropole. Additionally, this description relies heavily on the use of passive voice, distancing victims of empires like Kwi-hoon from Japan. While Hiroshima came at the end of World War II, the context of the previous years of war is largely not present in the museum, and there seems to be little acknowledgement of the ways Japan was steeped in militarism. The trauma of the bombing of Hiroshima allows Japan to position itself in public history squarely as a victim of World War II, rather than in a more accurate and complicated role as both a violent imperial power and the victim of a catastrophic bombing. To conclude, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum does amazing and important work remembering, preserving, and telling the stories of Hiroshima after the bombing. Further, it is a site of cultural remembrance and continues to do work in the world in order to create a more peaceful and denuclearized globe. The bombing is still impacting people today through lineages of survivors. Japan's commitment to pacifism and disarmament as a nation serve as a model and proof of the potential for pacifism in a modernizing world. And these are all objectively good things, as is grappling with and processing the very real trauma that occurred when the A-bombs were dropped. However, this processing and celebration of a contemporary Japan is deeply incomplete without the acknowledgement and critiquing of the ways pacifism is used to distance Japan from its history of violence. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum does not need to be the place where Japan documents in depth their history of militarism, but it must acknowledge it, and further, it must acknowledge the ways in which it as an institution continues to create public knowledge and memory, and how it creates a new national identity, one which is radically different than an imperial Japanese identity. Thank you so much for listening. This has been incredible. I would like to especially thank my professors, Evan Dolly and James Dater. You both have been absolutely remarkable teachers, and it has been an honor to be your student. And I'm very, very grateful for this experience. So thank you. Bye.